discs, plus $4.50 postage and handling to a treasury of golden classics, P.O. Box 8250, Atlanta, Georgia.
This is CNN.
To the U.S., it's a military command and control bunker. To Iraq, it's a civilian bomb shelter. Whatever it is, hundreds of people died inside it during an Allied air raid. This is CNN's continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf. I'm Catherine Cryer.
And I'm Ralph Wenge. U.S. military officials say they are confident that Allied warplanes destroyed an Iraqi military command center today and not a civilian bomb shelter, as Iraq has claimed. The Iraqis say about 500 civilians died in the attack, and it accuses the Allies of killing civilians on purpose. CNN's Peter Arnett has more on this report, which was cleared by Iraqi censors.
Husbands and fathers waited anxiously as bodies were brought out from the bomb shelter. By late afternoon, officials said 200 had been located and removed, leaving 300 more inside, they estimated, and many grieving relatives waiting for news of loved ones. Earlier, Baghdad firefighters had struggled to suppress the searing heat inside the shelter to reach steel doors that had been jammed shut by the force of the explosion. Witnesses said 2 bombs hit just before 5 o'clock in the morning. One victim was found inside a smoky hallway and the body removed. The shelter in Amaria was hit early morning after a night-long bombing campaign against Baghdad. Explosions could be seen and heard during the night, closer to the center of the city than in previous nights. The roof of this building is 15 feet deep of concrete, reinforced with steel bars. The bomb cut through it like butter. Residents said the shelter was constructed in 1984 as part of a community complex during the Iran-Iraq War. The block includes a mosque, a school, and a shopping center. The Baghdad police chief and the shelter manager both denied that the shelter was put to any use other than civilian, a place where local residents could seek shelter during air raids, they said. What is this area? What is this part of town? Are there any military targets here?
شنو هذه المنطقة؟ بها أي هدف عسكري؟ ماكو هنا أي هدف عسكري، منطقة سكنية صرفة. Absolutely, there is no any military target. It's just residential area.
Were there any military people in there at all?
اكو يعني احد من عسكري بالملجأ
اي عسكريين من الجيش ما يوجد في هذا الملجأ.
Absolutely, we don't have single military man in the shelter.
لأن هذا الملجأ مخصص للمواطنين.
Because this shelter is allocated for average people, for citizens.
Several people in the shelter survived the bomb blast, including 17-year-old Amar Adman. He said he had lost several members of his family.
We were covered with a blanket and we were hit by 2 blows. Rockets.
وحسيت اتمسكت بالبطانية. يعني الجو عباكيته ما صار.
And everything was converted into fire.
Others in the hospital included young children suffering from burn wounds. Late morning, reporters were shown victims' bodies laid out in the courtyard of the Yarmouk General Hospital. Most were suffering from severe burn wounds. Some were young children almost beyond recognition.
Our main problem is now the identification. How are we going to identify them? Their families. There's a child over there, 1 month old.
Iraq's Minister of Health charged that the shelter bombing was a deliberate attack on civilians designed to intimidate the population.
And what happened, it was really a criminal and medicated, well-planned attack against the civilians.
في الملجأ المخصص لهذا الغرض.
And President Bush and his allies made a big fuss about the oil spot in the Gulf, and they were talking about the dead birds, while they don't care and they kill those innocent people with cold blood.
Spending nights in shelters is becoming a routine for many of the people still living in Baghdad, a habit picked up along with the 4 consecutive weeks of Allied airstrikes against the city. Officials could not immediately come up with the numbers of shelters in the Iraqi capital or whether many others are of the same design as the bomb structure in Amaria. Peter Arnett, CNN, Baghdad.
The Bush administration has described the loss of civilian lives as a tragic consequence of war. More now on the administration's reaction from Charles Bierbauer, standing by live at the White House. Charles.
Indeed, no one here questions that the civilian deaths are very much a tragedy, regardless of how they came about. The problem for the U.S. was how to deal with something that seemed almost bound to happen at some point under the extensive bombardment of Iraq. The civilian deaths in Baghdad hit Washington like a live grenade, which the White House sought to hurl back at Saddam Hussein.
We don't know why civilians were at this location, but we do know that Saddam Hussein does not share our value in the sanctity of life. Indeed, he time and again has shown a willingness to sacrifice civilian lives and property that further his war aims.
U.S. officials say the loss of life is tragic, but insist the target was military.
A hardened bunker, camouflage painted on top, plugged into his military communication system. We did, in fact, drop 2 bombs on it. They hit with great precision, and there's no question in my mind or in the mind of our key people that what we hit was a military target.
U.S. officials say the bombing was not a mistake. The bunker had been on the target list for some time. The U.S. and its allies have documented many successful attacks on military targets. Reporters in Iraq, though, have only been shown civilian casualties. The White House has been frankly worried about a propaganda advantage for Saddam Hussein.
You're this one-sided propaganda machine cranking out a lot of myths and falsehoods, but I don't think the world is buying it, frankly.
World opinion is a concern. The civilian tragedy comes just days after Soviet President Gorbachev worried that the war against Iraq could go too far. Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz is due in Moscow this weekend to hear more Soviet peace ideas. Even before the latest bombing of Baghdad, there were anti-American demonstrations in the Arab world. So far, though, no Arab or Muslim state has bolted the coalition.
Well, I don't think they will have any impact on the coalition, and things will be going on as usual, as planned.
U.S. officials and their allies counter that Saddam Hussein himself has been responsible for civilian deaths with his Scud missile attacks and the occupation of Kuwait.
He kills civilians intentionally and with purpose.
I think the public opinion here will be more moved by the tragedies taking inside Kuwait than what we saw this morning on television.
U.S. officials say there is a targeting dilemma with Iraq deploying its military facilities at schools, in villages, and even at archaeological sites such as the Ziggurat Pyramid in the ancient city of Ur.
Recent satellite imagery obtained just this morning indicates that there are now 2 MiG-21s, combat aircraft of the Iraqi Air Force, parked right next to the pyramid.
It is that high-tech ability to find targets and to destroy them that has created an expectation of nearly infallible precision in this war. But what we are seeing in the Baghdad bombing is the fatal result of what the smart bombs could not see. Catherine?
Charles, you mentioned a concern on the part of the White House about a propaganda advantage in this incident. How do you assess this aspect of the war?
Well, it is a concern. In this particular instance, probably no one comes out all that well. The White House spokesman Fitzwater has taken the high moral ground, says that it's Saddam Hussein's fault that the civilians were there. But for the moment, it is still the pictures of the civilian casualties that people will remember, at least, as we say, for the moment. That may be forgotten as time passes and the war either ends or gets worse. Catherine?
Thank you, Charles. Charles Bierbauer at the White House. Ralph?
As we told you earlier, U.S. officials say they're positive the building destroyed in Baghdad was a military command center, but they have provided few specifics on just how they know that. CNN's Wolf Blitzer joins us now from the Pentagon with more on why the Allies went after that particular building. Wolf?
Ralph, U.S. officials say they had been keeping a close watch on the shelter for weeks, and while they regret the loss of civilian life, they insist it was a legitimate military target.
It was 4:30 Wednesday morning in Baghdad when 2 laser-guided precision bombs leveled what Pentagon officials say was a major military command and control facility. At least one of those bombs is said to have gone right down the air shaft, just like this one that destroyed Iraq's Air Defense Ministry in Baghdad during the first days of the war. Officials say the 2-story building was not a high priority at the start of the war, but it became one after the major military facilities in the city were destroyed. The Pentagon says U.S. electronic intercepts began discovering military communications coming from the shelter.
command and control facility that was there was active. It was associated with passing orders.
Pentagon officials concede that the building was originally constructed as an air raid shelter at the start of the Iran-Iraq War. But by the mid-1980s, it was converted into a military communications facility.
We bombed a building that had barbed wire around it, not an indication of a bomb shelter. We bombed a building that had a camouflage roof painted on it.
Accompanied by charts, Pentagon officials said U.S. intelligence spotted both military personnel and vehicles entering the compound. They said the communications equipment had been hardened with very sophisticated electromagnetic pulse protection to withstand a nuclear strike. And they add that the 10 to 15-foot concrete ceiling had been reinforced with steel.
There certainly is a possibility that there were civilians inside, and that's a shame, but we acted in good faith and in a military regime.
General Kelly said the U.S. would continue to try to avoid civilian areas in Iraq, although he insisted that military targets would be attacked.
I would say to people of Iraq, the safest place for them at night is home in their beds, because we're not bombing neighborhoods.
Officials say they didn't know civilians were inside the building, and they insist that if they did, they would not have bombed it. Wolf Blitzer, CNN, reporting live from the Pentagon.
And when our coverage of the war continues, we'll have the latest on the peace initiative from the Soviet Union.
Fine.
Bit soft on the head, but up.
I'm gonna.
Where's your numbers?
Ask the primary. With this trough, as it moves in, will increase.
It's time to act. Operations officers are given a weather briefing so they're acquainted with the potential hazards of the coming hours.
This will be our next major area of concern because we'll get the dry lightning.
Must be. Friendly smile is June.
P-miss.
Player, they made it too.
I don't know, honey.
Everyone who's looking for a great deal.
If after test driving a Sterling, you find another car with all of its standard features and appointments for $28,500 or less, we'll do more than congratulate you. We'll buy it for you.
With the battering of Baghdad intensifying, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tarek Aziz is preparing for further peace talks. He heads to Moscow on Sunday to continue where Soviet envoy Yevgeny Primakov and Saddam Hussein left off. Primakov is now back in Moscow. CNN's Claire Shipman has more.
Just back from Baghdad, Soviet presidential envoy Yevgeny Primakov said he was optimistic after his talks with Saddam Hussein.
I would be wrong if I told you hopes for a ceasefire prevailed. But there were glimmers which leave room for more optimistic thinking.
Primakov said he'd seen plenty of evidence of civilian casualties, but was convinced civilians hadn't been targeted on purpose. He noted, however, the overnight bombing of a convention center near the Al Rashid Hotel.
That was definitely a non-military target.
He assured reporters that the Soviets were not backing away from their support of the U.S.-led coalition against Iraq, but he would not elaborate on his meeting with the Iraqi leader.
You see, I don't want to jeopardize the process of negotiation for future. That's why I don't want to go deeper into details.
Primakov said Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz plans to come to Moscow early next week to meet with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. There's speculation Primakov may have proposed a guarantee that Iraq would not be punished if Saddam Hussein withdrew his troops unconditionally from Kuwait. Interviewed by CNN just before the outbreak of hostilities, Primakov, who's known Saddam Hussein for 21 years, said he felt such assurances are crucial.
He needs guarantees that if he pulls troops out of Kuwait, he will not be attacked.
Also Wednesday, the Communist Party leadership of the Soviet armed forces bitterly denounced the U.S.-led campaign against Iraq. Gorbachev is under increasing pressure from the military, who now seem to have his ear, to back away from his support for the U.S.-led effort. The Soviet military has worked closely with the Iraqi military for decades, and many officers don't understand the sudden turnaround.
We betrayed them, just betrayed Iraq. And when you betray a friend, other friends start to look suspiciously at you. They leave you because they know you're a traitor.
If Gorbachev manages to play the peacemaker, he has much to gain. He would appease his army and the conservatives at home, polish his tarnished image in the West, and perhaps regain some of the Soviet Union's fading superpower status in the eyes of the world. Claire Shipman, CNN, Moscow.
A leftist guerrilla group, Germany's Red Army faction, is claiming responsibility for an attack today on the U.S. Embassy in Bonn. Witnesses say gunmen opened fire on the embassy with machine guns. German television says a number of bullets struck the building, but apparently no one was hurt. Authorities say they found a letter near the scene. It was apparently left behind by the Red Army faction. It says the attack was in response to Allied actions in the Gulf War.
An indication today that Syria would be willing to recognize Israel's right to exist as part of a post-war order in the Middle East. The assessment comes from German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher following talks with Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk al-Shara. Genscher says Syria is aware that the right of self-determination for Palestinians would mean, quote, Israel's right to exist is recognized and secured. So far, no official confirmation of this from Damascus. Israeli officials say they are optimistic, but cautious.
We have never denied the right of the Palestinians to exist. We have recognized the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. We don't have any problems with the definitions. But when it comes to have a peace negotiation, I believe the Syrians should not become the agents of the Palestinians, because they may be more extreme than the Palestinians themselves.
Israel and Syria have been at war 4 times since Israeli independence in 1948, and Syria is among the majority of Arab nations that currently deny Israel's right to exist.
And while all these developments have been taking place throughout the day, a lot has been happening at the United Nations. For the latest on that, let's go to CNN's Jeannie Mose. Jeannie?
Ralph, we are still waiting for a vote that's expected to lead to a private meeting of the UN Security Council, a private meeting that, well, they haven't had something like this for 15 years here. The private meeting would be just like the public meeting you see on television all the time, only this time you won't see it on television because it will be closed to the press. It'll be the same debate, but the press won't be allowed to attend. The U.S. and a majority of the Security Council members want it this way. They think it will send, if there were an open meeting televised, they think it would send the wrong message to Saddam Hussein that the United Nations isn't united on this. Now, right now, you are looking at the public part of the meeting, which is still going on. This will lead up to the vote to take the meeting behind closed doors. There have been a few speeches. First, you'll hear from the British ambassador, who favors a private meeting, then the ambassador from Yemen, who opposed it.
We should do nothing which could detract from the Council's unity of purpose or blur the signal that is sent to the outside world.
What is there to conceal? And from whom are we to conceal it?
The ambassador from Yemen also spoke of today's bombing that reportedly took the lives of hundreds of Iraqi civilians. He called it an event which shakes the conscience of every human being, and he said he couldn't believe that even the pilots who dropped the bombs would be happy with the results. Now, outside the council chamber, Iraq's ambassador also spoke about the bombing, saying it shows 2 things.
2 things. First, how savage and brutal this attack against Iraqi civilians, against all civilized institutions in Iraq. On the second hand, it shows how arrogant and how dishonest the American denial that the shelter was not civilians.
And Iraq has sent a letter to the UN accusing all of the countries who voted for the resolution authorizing the use of force, accusing all those countries of being accomplices in this bombing today that took those civilian lives. I'm Jeannie Mose reporting live from the United Nations.
And by the way, program note now, the man you just heard there, the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations, will be a guest on Larry King Live tonight at 9 o'clock Eastern. And we'll have more of our coverage of the war right after this.
The average cost of this luxury car is $37,000. The average cost of the American home is $134,000. The average cost of a private car